The professor became the student and never forgot. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Columbia University's history department, each droplet seeming to echo the steady tick of the grandfather clock that had presided over Professor Alastair Finch's office for over 2 decades. At 62, Dr. Finch commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His silver hair always perfectly combed, his navy blazer pressed to perfection, and his steel grey eyes capable of reducing graduate students to tears with a single withering glance. "Mediocrity disguised as scholarship," he muttered, red ink flowing across another dissertation as he sat behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by towers of leather-bound books that served as both his weapons and his fortress. The young woman across from him, Sarah Martinez, shifted nervously in her chair as he dissected her months of research with surgical precision. "Your analysis of the Industrial Revolution lacks any semblance of original thought. It reads like a Wikipedia entry, written by a particularly uninspired high school student." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, but Alastair felt nothing. Compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford in his pursuit of academic excellence. His reputation as the most brilliant historian in his field had been built on such moments, each criticism a brick in the wall that separated him from what he considered the intellectual peasantry that surrounded him. He had published 17 books, spoke 6 languages fluently, and could recite entire passages from ancient texts without hesitation. Knowledge was his god, and he was its most devoted priest. The headache began that evening as he graded papers in his sparse apartment overlooking Central Park. At first, it was merely an annoying throb behind his left temple, easily dismissed as the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But as the weeks passed, the pain intensified, accompanied by moments of disorientation that he attributed to stress. The first real warning came during a lecture on medieval European history, when he found himself staring at his notes, the familiar words suddenly appearing as incomprehensible hieroglyphs. "The Battle of Hastings occurred in," he began confidently, then stopped, his mind grasping for a date that had been as familiar to him as his own birthday just moments before. 150 students stared at him expectantly, their faces blurring together like watercolors in rain. 1066, he finally managed, but the word felt foreign on his tongue, as if he were speaking someone else's language. That night, alone in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of ancient civilizations captured in countless volumes, Alastair allowed himself to feel something he had never permitted before: fear. The MRI results 2 weeks later confirmed what his body had already begun to whisper: early-onset Alzheimer's disease, aggressive and unforgiving. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who had spent his life preserving the past would lose his own history first. Dr. Rebecca Chen, his neurologist, delivered the diagnosis with the kind of gentle professionalism that Alastair had always scorned in others. "We can slow the progression with medication," she explained, her voice soft against the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the medical center. "But I want you to consider making arrangements for long-term care. The disease is advancing rapidly, and you'll need support as your cognitive abilities decline." Alastair's world, so carefully constructed over decades of academic achievement, began to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to sunlight. The university forced him into early retirement, colleagues who had once sought his approval now avoiding his gaze in the hallways. His sister Margaret, the only family he had left after years of choosing books over relationships, flew in from California with tears in her eyes and brochures for care facilities in her hands. "Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation," she said, spreading glossy pamphlets across his kitchen table like tarot cards predicting an unwelcome future. "It's in upstate New York, very peaceful. The staff specializes in memory care, and the grounds are beautiful." He wanted to rage against this diminishment, to argue that his mind was still sharp enough to fight this disease alone. But the words came out jumbled, his thoughts scattering like leaves in an October wind. The man who had once commanded lecture halls now struggled to remember whether he had eaten breakfast or taken his medication. The professor who had never needed anyone was about to learn the most humbling lesson of his life, that knowledge without compassion was merely noise, and that sometimes the greatest teachers came disguised as the most unlikely students. The drive to Sunset Manor took 3 hours through the Hudson Valley, past towns with names that should have triggered historical memories, but now seemed as foreign as distant constellations. Margaret gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, stealing glances at her brother in the passenger seat as he stared out the window with an expression she had never seen before, vulnerability mixed with a terror that cut through his lifelong arrogance like a blade through silk. Sunset Manor sat nestled among rolling hills, painted in autumn colors, a sprawling complex of red brick buildings connected by covered walkways and surrounded by gardens that would have been beautiful if Alistair could have appreciated beauty anymore. Instead, he saw only his exile from the world he had ruled with intellectual supremacy. The lobby smelled of disinfectant masked by artificial pine, and the cheerful murals of pastoral scenes seemed to mock his descent from academic heights to what felt like a holding pen for the forgotten. "Dr. Finch, welcome to our family," chirped the administrator, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, whose smile was as professionally maintained as the facility's manicured lawns. She led them through hallways lined with residents shuffling in bathrobes and hospital gowns, some calling out to invisible companions, others staring into space with eyes that held neither recognition nor hope. This was his future, Alistair realized, with a clarity that felt more like a curse than a gift. His room was sterile and small, furnished with the kind of bland efficiency that institutional living demanded. 2 single beds, 2 dressers, and a shared bathroom with grab bars that screamed of dependency. His roommate was Harold, an 80-year-old former accountant who spent his days arranging and rearranging a collection of bottle caps with the dedication of a master craftsman, occasionally looking up to ask Alistair if he had seen his wife Betty, dead now for 15 years. "The staff here is wonderful," Margaret said, her voice too bright as she helped him unpack the few belongings he had deemed essential, some favorite books, photographs from his academic career, and the fountain pen he had used to grade thousands of papers over the decades. Dr. Chen spoke highly of their memory care program. "You'll have activities, therapy sessions, and the social interaction will be good for you." Alistair wanted to tell her that he had never needed social interaction before, that people had always been obstacles to his intellectual pursuits rather than sources of comfort. But the words wouldn't come in the right order, and by the time he had arranged his thoughts, Margaret was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and a promise to visit every weekend. The first weeks were a special kind of hell designed for a man whose identity had been built entirely on mental acuity. The daily routine felt like a prison sentence: breakfast at 7 with food he couldn't taste, group activities that assumed the mental capacity of children, and therapy sessions where well-meaning professionals asked him to identify pictures of common objects, as if he were taking some perverse intelligence test in reverse. "What's this, Doctor Finch?" asked Jennifer, the occupational therapist, holding up a photograph of a telephone. The condescension in her voice made his blood boil, but when he opened his mouth to deliver the kind of withering response that had once terrorized graduate students, only silence emerged. The word was there, somewhere in the growing fog of his mind, but he couldn't grasp it. The other residents either ignored him completely or tried to engage him in conversations about television programs he had never watched and grandchildren he didn't have. At meals, he found himself seated with Rose, who insisted that President Roosevelt was coming to visit and that they needed to prepare, with Thomas, who believed he was still fighting in Vietnam, and with Eleanor, who spoke only in whispers about the angels she could see in the corners of the dining room. "You're new here, aren't you, dear?" Eleanor asked during his 3rd dinner at the facility, her paper-thin hand reaching across the table to pat his arm. "Don't worry. The angels told me you're going to be just fine." They said someone special is going to help you remember who you really are. Alistair pulled his arm away with the automatic disdain that had become his default response to human contact. But Eleanor's words haunted him as he lay in his narrow bed that night, listening to Harold's gentle snoring and the distant sound of someone crying in the hallway. He had spent his entire career studying the past, but now his own past was disappearing piece by piece, leaving him stranded in a present that felt increasingly foreign and frightening. The man, who had never believed in anything he couldn't prove, was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes wearing scrubs and speaking with the wisdom of the heart rather than the mind. Lena Vasquez arrived for her first day at Sunset Manor with coffee-stained scrubs, rain-dampened hair escaping from a hastily assembled ponytail, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from needing a job more than wanting one. At 28, she had never imagined herself working in memory care, but life had a way of writing stories that defied expectation. 3 years of community college, 2 jobs to support her daughter Sophia, and a recent divorce had led her to this moment, standing in Patricia's office while being briefed on the residents who would become her responsibility. Dr. Finch in room 12B can be challenging, Patricia explained, flipping through a file thick with incident reports. He was a prominent historian before his diagnosis, very intelligent, very proud, and not adjusting well to his circumstances. He's been through 4 caregivers in 2 months. The last one quit after he threw a book at her head. Lena nodded, though her stomach clenched. She had dealt with difficult people before. Her ex-husband's alcoholism had been excellent training in patience and persistence, but this felt different. What does he need help with? Everything, though he'll fight you every step of the way. Personal care, medication management, orientation activities. His condition is progressing rapidly, but his personality, Patricia paused diplomatically, remains intact. When Lena first knocked on the door of room 12B, she found Alistair sitting rigidly in the chair by the window, still dressed in the button-down shirt and pressed slacks that were his armor against the casual degradation of institutional life. He didn't acknowledge her presence, his grey eyes fixed on some point beyond the glass, where autumn was surrendering to winter with the same reluctance he felt about surrendering to his disease. Dr. Finch, I'm Lena, your new caregiver. Her voice carried the musical accent of her grandmother's Spanish, softened by years in New York, but never completely erased. I thought we could start by getting to know each other. I don't need a caregiver, he said, without turning around, his words precise despite the tremor in his hands that betrayed his condition. I certainly don't need to get to know someone whose educational achievements likely peaked in high school. The insult hit its mark, but Lena had learned long ago that cruelty often masked fear. She moved closer, noting the way his shoulders tensed, the slight confusion in his eyes when he finally looked at her. You're right. I didn't go to college the way you did. But I know what it's like to feel lost and scared, and I think maybe that's more important right now than any degree. Over the following days, Lena learned to navigate the minefield of Alistair's pride and growing confusion. She discovered that direct approaches triggered his defensive anger, but gentle persistence could sometimes breach his walls. When he refused to take his medications, insisting that a quack doctor couldn't possibly understand his condition better than he did, Lena would sit quietly nearby until his agitation subsided, then offer the pills with water and a patience that seemed infinite. "Tell me about your books," she said one afternoon, noticing how his eyes lit up when he looked at the volumes Margaret had brought from his office. For a moment, his face transformed, the harsh lines softening as he reached for a leather-bound text on medieval European history. "This is a first edition of Froissart's Chronicles," he began, his voice taking on the professor's cadence he had perfected over decades. "The account of the 100 Years' War is unparalleled in its detail, though modern historians debate the accuracy of certain battle descriptions. His words trailed off as he struggled to remember what he had been explaining, confusion clouding his features like a storm rolling across a clear sky. "It sounds fascinating," Lena said genuinely, and something in her tone seemed to anchor him. "What drew you to history in the first place?" The question surprised him, partly because no one had asked it in years, and partly because he wasn't sure he remembered the answer. He closed the book carefully, his fingers tracing the embossed title as if it might hold the key to his disappearing self. "I suppose I wanted to understand how we got here, how the past shaped the present." He looked up at her, and for the first time since arriving at Sunset Manor, he seemed to see her as more than just another obstacle to his dignity. "That makes sense," Lena replied, pulling a chair closer to his. "Maybe you could help me understand some things too. I never learned much history in school, but I've always wondered about the people behind the big events, what they felt, how they managed when everything they knew was changing." It was such a simple request, so different from the academic debates and intellectual competitions that had defined his career. Yet it stirred something in Alistair that had been dormant for longer than his illness could account for. Here was someone asking not for his expertise or his credentials, but for his wisdom about the human experience. As the winter afternoon faded into evening, he found himself talking not about dates and treaties, but about courage and loss, about how ordinary people had faced extraordinary challenges throughout history. And for the first time in months, he felt like himself again, not the diminished patient or the angry exile, but the teacher he had always been meant to be. Spring arrived early that year, painting the grounds of Sunset Manor with delicate greens and the kind of soft light that made even institutional buildings look hopeful. Alistair's decline had been steady but not uniform. Some days his mind was sharp enough to engage in complex discussions with Lena about historical parallels to current events, while other days he couldn't remember her name or why she was helping him shower. But something fundamental had shifted in their relationship, a bridge built from mutual respect that spanned the growing gaps in his memory. "Dr. Finch, can you tell me about this photograph?" Lena asked during one of their afternoon sessions, holding up a picture Margaret had brought of him, receiving an award from the American Historical Association. In the photo, he stood behind a podium wearing academic regalia, his face bearing the confident smile of a man who had conquered his chosen field. But the Alistair looking at the picture now seemed like a stranger to himself, the connection to that triumphant moment lost in the fog that increasingly defined his days. I don't remember," he admitted, the words coming harder than any academic failure ever had. "I know it should mean something, but it's like looking at someone else's life." Lena set the photograph aside and took his hands in hers, her touch warm and steady. "That's okay. Let's talk about something you do remember. Tell me about the day you decided to become a teacher." The question unlocked something deeper than recent memories, reaching into the bedrock of his identity that even Alzheimer's couldn't entirely erode. "I was 8 years old," he began, his voice growing stronger as the memory surfaced. "My third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was reading us a story about ancient Egypt. I remember thinking that people who lived thousands of years ago were just as real as we were, just as important. When she finished, I raised my hand and said I wanted to learn about all the people who came before us." What did she say? "She smiled and told me that learning about the past was one of the most important jobs in the world because it helped us understand who we are." His eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in decades. "I spent my whole career thinking knowledge was about being smarter than everyone else. But Mrs. Patterson knew something I forgot. It's about connecting with other people, not separating yourself from them." As his condition progressed, Lena adapted their time together to meet him where he was rather than where he had been. On his worst days, when language became impossible and confusion reigned, she would play classical music, Bach's Goldberg variations, which seemed to calm his agitated mind, and simply sit with him, her presence a constant in his increasingly chaotic world. On better days, she encouraged him to share not scholarly analysis, but personal stories, his childhood in Vermont, his complicated relationship with his father, the loneliness he had chosen in pursuit of academic success. "I pushed everyone away," he confessed during one of their walks through the facility's garden, his words coming slowly but with painful clarity. "My colleagues, my students, even Margaret. I thought emotions made people weak, but I was the weak one. I was afraid of being vulnerable, so I chose to be alone." Lena paused by the rose bushes that were just beginning to bloom, their fragrance mixing with the scent of fresh-cut grass and possibility. "But you're not alone now," she said simply. "And look how much you've taught me about history, about courage, about what it means to be human. Maybe this is just another kind of teaching." The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. Alistair didn't wake up one morning as a completely different person. Instead, it happened in small moments. The way he began greeting other residents by name instead of avoiding them, his patience when Harold asked about Betty for the 100th time, his gentle encouragement when Eleanor shared her visions of angels. The man who had once viewed compassion as weakness discovered that it was actually the highest form of strength. By midsummer, his ability to form new memories had almost completely disappeared, but something deeper remained, a warmth in his interactions, a kindness that seemed to emanate from his very soul. During their final coherent conversation, he took Lena's hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. "I won't remember your name tomorrow," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'll remember how you made me feel. You taught me that the most important history isn't written in books. It's written in hearts. You showed me that love is the only lesson that really matters." Even as his mind retreated further into the mist, that lesson remained. Staff members noticed how his face would light up when Lena entered the room, though he could no longer say why. Visitors remarked on the peace that seemed to surround him, a serenity that spoke of battles fought and won on the most important battlefield of all, the human heart. The professor had become the student, and though his memories faded like autumn leaves, the love he had finally learned to give and receive proved to be the one thing that was truly unforgettable. In learning to be human, Alistair Finch had finally mastered the only subject that mattered, taught by a teacher whose classroom was compassion and whose curriculum was written in the language of the heart.